Hey, it's Prospector Jess. I'm going to bring you a little bit of a current event right now. You've heard of Lake Oroville or the Oroville Dam up in Northern California. This is in gold country on Route 49, and it's a very interesting place because it'll give you a little insight into how water moves gold. It'll also give you insight into what's behind those dams and the history of that whole area. So hang on, let me go into that a little bit. First, I'm going to draw up a little picture to kind of give us something to work with, a diagram. So. So there we have it. We're going to go into this in a second here. Let me explain as I go through, but this is where we start. The dam's construction. I'll go a little bit over what that has to do with the geometry of the dam, storm and snowmelt and the role it plays, why it's so easy for everybody to be critical of the engineers that did this and not really recognize what's going on here. It's not just political, it's not engineering, it's complicated, as most life is. There's risks involved that I will go into. But the main thing I want you to look at here is this power equation. This power equation has to do with how much energy comes from flowing water as it drops, specifically the potential energy to kinetic energy, which shows up, and we can refer to it in terms of kilowatts. That's the amount of watts, that is the amount of energy consumed over a period of time. So it's the amount of material moved, as in pounds of water, over the number of feet, over the amount of time, seconds. And so what you'll find out is that this number is huge when it comes to this reservoir. And when it comes to most applications of roaring and raging rivers for recovery of gold. So that's why it relates to gold, and I'll get into that in a second. Let's start off with this picture. So Lake Oroville is one of the largest lakes in the state of California. It is the tallest reservoir in the United States, continental United States. And as such, it's constructed of a particular design that's safe or safer in the area when it comes to earthquakes. You have to have that in California. But it also has some other properties that make it riskier when it comes to flows. We'll talk about that in a moment. Those flows in the context of gold are what I will tell you about in the long run, showing you in this series of Miner's Minutes about this subject, because I think you'll find it quite interesting and illustrative of what happens when a flood or a storm strikes a river basin and moves rocks and boulders and gold. So, first thing, the Oroville Dam at its crest to its base is 770 feet tall. That's larger, or taller rather, than the St. Louis Arch, to give you an idea. It's a huge distance from top to bottom. Now, in addition, we have a storm runoff combined with snowmelt, because the storms that have been striking the coast due to atmospheric rivers, they call them, has been particularly warm. It's coming from Hawaii and south of there. So what happens is when that rain hits the snow that built up before from the cold storms that have been building up snow to the tune of dozens of feet, it melts the snow and has the storm runoff as well. So you get this double factor going on. That basically goes into your reservoir. That's what this line shows right here. That water flowing in is what basically has to be accounted for in the buildup of water behind the dam. When the water hits a certain amount, the water overflows, goes down the basic overflows that are designed into the system. The problem is, if you have too much water overflowing for the existing design, these concrete ramparts, you're going to have to use the emergency overflow, which is basically designed to go down the riprap next to the base or next to the edge of the dam. And that's where we'll get into a little discussion about what happens in your gold prospecting, because in both cases we see damage to the system. That damage is not something you can easily explain unless you understand the amount of energy that's going on, the amount of power that we're talking about. So, looking at what's happening here, you can see that at the peak we had 100,000 cubic feet per second flowing over the top of this reservoir, top of the dam rather. 100,000 cubic feet per second, and the water was still building from this input. What that essentially says is we had more than 100,000 cubic feet per second coming in. More coming in than goes out, the reservoir builds up and overflows. More goes out than comes in, the reservoir drops. That's what we've been having with all these droughts. So right now what we see is at 770 feet, we are producing, so H is equal to 770. This equation I've given here is basically in terms of kilowatts, and the units are going to be cubic feet per second is Q, okay? And our height is 770 feet. And so per second. So this number is 100,000 and times 770. See how big this number just got. Divided by 11.8 gives us the kilowatts. That's 1,000 watts. So the end result of this equation is a ginormous number I'll show right here. So what you want to be aware of is how much energy that is. This is bigger than a Saturn V rocket by quite a bit. At its peak, that energy goes into two things. The fall, so when it hits the bottom, it turns into kinetic energy from potential. That kinetic energy can cause a tremendous amount of damage down here based on how fast it falls. Unless you build in friction on the way. That's why the riprap design of these things and why they both have rough surfaces. The problem is those rough surfaces pull away a bit of the energy. As they pull away the energy, you get damage. Boom. First thing that happened, we blew some holes in the concrete here that over the years it had taken on too much wear and had some ice and weather damage to them, causing a hole to develop in the concrete rampart. That slowed down. What they did is they cut off the water into this and slowed down the amount of damage. That caused the water to rise in the reservoir, causing water to overflow over here and damage this. Now watch what happened over here the minute they had this thing going on full bore. They had hoped that they would be able to take a little bit of this riprap off and some of the trees and dirt. Instead, they started chewing into this hole. Sideways, it looked something like this, where they were chewing a great big chunk out of the side of the mountain, and they were afraid that this whole area would collapse with the water flow going over, that they would lose control and chop off the top part of the dam. That would cause an immediate rush from 770 feet to the floor of the valley. What you need to understand from the standpoint of gold prospecting is that's just the kind of erosion amplified by a large value, of course, but that's the kind of erosion that will unleash from this material a huge amount of gold ore and nuggets that are buried underneath this kind of rubble. It's way bigger than anything that was ever done in the gold rush in the way of prospecting using what they call monitors, or these big huge fire hoses that blew down mountains. This is a very large amount of water, something like 3.5 million acre feet in volume. That's 4.3 cubic kilometers of water. The normal use for this water is, of course, a combination of protection of everything downstream during these atmospheric flows, which, by the way, there was one in the 1860s that you can look up. I think it was 1868, which pretty much wiped out the town of Sacramento and a whole bunch of the Central Valley, turned it into a lake that was up to 30 feet deep in places. These are designed to control that kind of flooding. In addition, they also are designed to produce hydropower. Normally, the water goes out through these hydropower outlets and gets routed to aqueducts, etc., under control, or back into the river that flows away from them. In this case, there isn't any outlet for that. There's just too much water coming in. And so what happens is they use these emergency outlets, and they use some of the hydropower outlets as well as some bypass valves to control this extra water, to remove the energy from what's behind the dam so that it doesn't destroy the dam. We want to know this erosion factor and how it works, and I'll get into that in the next few miners minutes. But for now, this is what's going on with Lake Oroville in California in 2017. Stay tuned for more, because we really don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. We still aren't done with these storms this season. It's a big one. You might ask me offline how I know so much about this hydropower stuff. It's another story, another part of Prospector Jess. So, Prospector Jess, over now.